So we left Granville Crawford walking 11 miles to Hartford, Kentucky to give testimony in his niece slander's trial. So as you can see, he was one of a number of witnesses called by both sides, a list that includes several of his own children. Unfortunately, we don't have the actual trial testimony, but in looking at the witness list, it's obvious that Mary Cannon was relying on her family to support her. It's also interesting that both sides seem to have called Samuel C. Crawford as a witness. Now, this might be a good time for a side trip into another topic we're interested in, and the service of Granville's son or sons in the Union Army during the Civil War. You'll remember 2 Samuel C's were listed as living in the Crawford home during the 1870 census. The elder Samuel had enlisted in the Union Army for a 3-year term on November 2nd, 1861, joining the 17th Kentucky Volunteer Infantry. Unfortunately, Samuel had some problems while serving in the military. He was continually absent from duty, apparently from a combination of recurring illnesses and perhaps being taken prisoner by rebel forces. He was eventually charged with desertion and was court-martialed. He was found guilty and sentenced to make his time good and forfeit all pay and allowances from December the 16th, 1862 to December the 16th, 1863. The Army transferred him to Company C of the 21st Regiment, Kentucky, to serve out his time. His military career wasn't a happy one, but we can confirm that at least one of Granville Crawford's sons served in the Union Army during the Civil War. But remember, there was a second Samuel C. Crawford listed in that 1870 census report, a 14-year-old. The older Samuel had died by the time Granville walked to Hartford to testify in the Cannon versus Bug case, so he can't have been the Samuel C. Crawford called as a witness in that case. But we think we know who that man was. Our research uncovered another one of Granville Crawford's sons, Leonard, who had a 3-year-old son named Samuel, listed in the 1860 census. Leonard lived next door to his father in 1860, so it's very possible that 10 years later during the 1870 census, his son Samuel was visiting his grandparents. In any case, that Samuel would have been about 20 when witnesses were called to testify in Cannon versus Bug. But we don't know why he was called by both sides. That's still a mystery. We do know how the case turned out. And Tamla, do you want to dare to make a guess?
I'm afraid.
You're afraid? Well, I was too till I found out. Well, it's time to find out. Despite Granville's best efforts, the final ruling went against his niece, Mary Cannon. Court records indicate that on November 21st, 1877, a trial by consent ordered that Mary Bug was to receive from Mary E. and J.B. Cannon the sum of $5,000, with $4,500 remitted to her, and of course the remainder to cover court and lawyers' fees. But more sad news for the Crawford and Cannon families was to come the next year, when Granville himself died on the 19th of December, 1878. But wait, this Ohio County saga has yet another chapter. As the ruling in favor of his daughter Mary was about to be made, Dr. J.F. Bug encountered some legal problems of his own. In October 1877, the Commonwealth of Kentucky brought a case against him to the local grand jury on a charge of unlawfully practicing medicine. A few months later, in April 1878, he was indicted on that charge in the Ohio County Criminal Court. At the time, Dr. Bug put up a $100 bond to guarantee his appearance, but a few days later, he absconded back to Indiana, landing in Grandview, just across the Ohio River. So as you can see, the local paper couldn't resist having some fun with the doctor's name. Humbug, bye-bye bug. Given the court case brought against him, it would be easy to assume that the doctor was a charlatan, more interested in legal maneuvering than in healing patients. But a little historical context is in order before we can render our verdict. The practice of medicine in Kentucky was changing during those years, and Dr. Bugg was not the only one affected. In 1874, the Kentucky legislature passed an act authorizing the governor to appoint a state board of medical examiners. The goal was to establish criteria for being able to practice medicine in Kentucky. And to find out more about that, we went to Professor Jamie Day at Transylvania University's Monroe Musnick Medical and Science Museum. Watch this.
Well, Transy was founded in 1780, and by 1799 we had a medical school which operated for 60 years. So our last graduate finished in 1859. And then the Civil War came along and all of these artifacts were put away in storage. Some of them were kept in our medical school building, which burned during the war. And we actually had students and faculty rush into the flames and rescue a lot of these artifacts. So they have a great history. After the war, they were put away in storage again and not discovered till roughly the 1920s. And by that time they were antique and they were recognized for their historic value as well as their scientific value. Correct formal education you could get from Transy would be 2 years of study. And they did have summer breaks, and they were fairly short semesters. But they would study for a total of 2 years with our faculty, and they would study anatomy, surgery, materia medica, which is basically pharmacy, obstetrics, sort of the basic things that we study today, but with different titles. But it was possible, if you had been practicing kind of as an understudy, that you could get some credit for work that you had done in the past. But we know that other people claimed that they had a Transy degree, and people probably just didn't check. If you were a doctor in the wilderness or some rough area in Kentucky and said you went to Transylvania and you were dressed right, people probably believed you. We were the third medical school in the country, and at times we were as well equipped as any school in the country. It was always a problem that there were people in the country, even in the city, who were practicing medicine who didn't really know what they were doing. And also pharmacy was a very unregulated thing at the time, so people could make up their own medicines with all kinds of horrible compounds in them and sell them from the back of a wagon, make a lot of money and then skip town, for example, or practice as a physician in a small rural community and really have no training. And as long as you were just treating colds and delivering babies, if you had experience with that, it would be okay. But if a serious disease came along or an epidemic, then there could be big trouble. If you practiced medicine for at least 10 years, you could be grandfathered in. I guess the assumption being if you had lasted a decade as a doctor, you probably knew enough about what you were doing to continue. If you got caught and if your community complained, then you would be tried. You could be sentenced up to 30 days in prison. You could be fined $100, which was a decent chunk of money back then. Even for quack physicians, that was a lot of money. If you were decent at what you did, most communities didn't complain. So this act was set up to protect the community from the whole state of Kentucky from charlatans and quacks. And to ensure that it was successful, the governor appointed a commission of 5 physicians who would interview doctors, quiz them on things like anatomy, physiology, and so forth. And they ultimately had the decision of whether this person should practice or not.